But at the end, when there's a new bombing, we will bring candles, we will bring flowers and tissues to wipe away the tears as we retreat again into submission. Well, today marks the day when we say we will be silenced no longer. We have had enough. Enough of the terror. Enough of the lies. Enough of the hatred. And enough of the stealth takeover of our democracy and our freedom.
Guys, please can someone hold the camera? She's got your star arm. Thank you, thank you. So next up we have Sharon. Again, she's from the Jewish community, and I'm hoping she has a lot to say to us.
Hello, my name is Sharon. I'm busy introduced me there. We work together. We have an organisation called Campaign for Truth, and it was named Campaign for Truth because we realised around about 2007-8 that we weren't hearing the truth, that we were reading newspapers, we were listening to the news, we were watching the BBC, but we weren't hearing what was going on, and we decided to form this organisation so that we could begin to speak the truth. And I want to make a statement before I actually say anything, and my statement is this. I wrote it down. I said, my name is Sharon, I'm an activist, and I stand for the freedom of our Western Judeo-Christian democracy, hard fought for by our forefathers and our foremothers, so that we, all of us here, could live our lives in safety and most of all in freedom, based in human decency and human rights for all. And so I'm standing here, also having been warned that I shouldn't be here amongst you guys. And I'm looking around and I see quite a diverse bunch of people. So I'm really quite proud to stand here as a Jew. And I need to tell you, as you can hear in my accent, that I'm born in South Africa. I was born in a police state. I know about a police state. My identity was defined for me, first as a white person, then as a woman, and then as a Jew. And it was spread over me like a veil, much like we see a lot of veils around today. And there was that illogical hatred that went with it, that age-old ancient hatred for the Jews that most of you will know as anti-Semitism. And that's how I grew up, and I grew up in silence. Nobody, when I grew up, would tell anybody, not their neighbors, not their friends, what they thought, because they lived in fear. They lived in fear of arrest, they lived in fear of being slung in jail for speaking out against the government who dictated to us what we should be, what we should think, and what we should talk about. So I came here at the age of 21, and you can imagine how I felt when I arrived here and I smelled the air of freedom. It was the most amazing freedom that probably most of you here just took for granted because you grew up with it. But I arrived here on a long working holiday with my new husband, and I decided on that day that I got off the boat. I came over on an ocean liner, by the way, because people didn't fly around too much then. And when I got off that boat, I actually said to my husband, I'm not going back, and I never went home. And I stayed here. But I'm afraid that I'm very sad to stand here today and to say to you that we no longer can take that freedom for granted, because we don't really have that freedom anymore. We have the thought police around. We're watched. We're told what to say. If we speak out about certain issues in our society, we're not allowed to say it, or we will be sanctioned. Some people have been arrested and been sent to jail for speaking out against it. So I don't need to remind you that what is happening here in the UK, most of the speakers here have spoken about it. But I don't need to remind you of what the terrorism that went on. I don't need to remind you about a woman who watched her sister's throat being slit at the massacre on London Bridge. Most of you will not have read about that massacre. You would have read about a terrorist attack, but it was a massacre. And I know about that massacre because I have my child who works there. She works amongst the people who were attacked. I don't have to tell you about, or maybe I do need to tell a lot of you about the attacks that take place in Israel, because you don't read about them here. You read about the people who were killed, who perpetrate the attacks, but you don't really read about why those terrorists are killed. I was in Israel the week before. A beautiful center called Serona Market was blown up and people were killed. It was the most terrible thing to watch that on an Israeli news screen, because it wasn't reported here in the UK. And I also don't need to describe to you that policeman who was around the corner here somewhere when he was stabbed and his last breath floated across the river. And we were silent because we couldn't really speak about who perpetrated that evil. And in my own family, I have been close to that evil. My daughter was caught up in a terrorist bomb in 1994 when she was doing a summer job at the Israeli embassy. And I can tell you that 2 hours of not knowing where she was probably the worst experience of my life. And when I fast forward to 7/7, her school friend got off the train and jumped on that fatal bus and was killed. And I went to a funeral and I watched these young children crying for this girl whose life was taken away by extremists. So this year is a year of a lot of centenaries, a lot of memories, and a lot of world event markers. So we have here 2017 is marking, you may not have seen it on your screens, 16 years since 9/11, 2001. But 2017 also marks 334 years since 9/11, 1683, when the Ottomans were stopped from entering Hungary, at a time then when Buddha and Pest were divided, with the king to the west and the sultan to the east. And I think we're still suffering from that east-west divide. And if we look back then, war was fought by foot soldiers, with people, bands playing and trumpets calling the shots. Today, war is very different. Today, we are fought in our homes, in our cities, on our trains, and war is instant and news travels very quickly, and it's conducted by remote control. So we've had all these terrorist attacks. We've had London Bridge, we've had Manchester, and we brought candles and we brought flowers, and we've cried until our tears dry on our cheeks. And we have a Prime Minister who sits over there somewhere across the road, and she made a fantastic speech when she said to us, enough is enough. And I just need to ask her, what is enough and what is it enough of? So I'm going to bring to you something that you may not have, a direction of thought that you may not have thought about. To understand why extremist, fundamentalist, terrorist activity has come to our western shores, we need to understand something of the turmoil across in the Middle East. This plays a central role in what is happening here today, and I think many people don't realize it because you don't hear about the attacks in Jerusalem or the attacks in Savannah Market in the same way that you hear about London Bridge and Parsons Green and so on. So there's a battle taking place, and it's a very, it's sort of the watershed battle that's taking place, and it's the battle for the soul of Jerusalem. It is essential to understand that what is going on in Israel is not a land grab, it's not a battle about geography, it's a battle for Jerusalem. And what do I mean by Jerusalem? At the root of the problem lies the Jewish people. The Jewish people are there who actually stand in the way of an ideology that sees itself as the third and final incarnation of Judeo-Christian monotheism, to correct and finally supersede the Jewish and the Christian revelations, so that the fantasy of Andalusia can be recreated in our world. Now, I'm sure you all know what Andalusia is. Somebody earlier referred to Spain. Who was it? Sam spoke about Spain and how the Moors had come there and they'd run the place for a long time. And there's this dream that they can recreate this Andalusian divinity. And the problem is that the Jews just won't go away. This year is 5778 on our Jewish calendar, and we're here to stay. I had the story explained to me by a young man from Tajikistan who I knew, who told me once that he was re-embracing his family's ancient religion at the breakup of the Soviet Union. And of course, that was Islam. And so I asked him what he was studying. And he showed me a drawing by way of explanation. He drew for me what looked like a fried egg. And he waved his hand across it and he said, this here and the whole fried egg is Islam. And in the middle, the yolk, sits the Jews. And they won't scramble. They won't join in this third reincarnation, which is our right. And when I asked him where the Christians were, he just said to me, oh, they're in there somewhere. And this is the problem I find, because what we're seeing today is we're seeing Christians being killed and nobody's speaking out. I don't know how many of you know that Copts of Egypt was a huge majority in Egypt. And they've been killed off, and I don't see anybody marching in the streets and crying about it. The Jews today have Israel, and Israel stands up for our rights as Jews. So in a way, we feel protected, but Israel is something else. It's actually the incarnation of the Jews. Israel represents the Jews of the world, and this is why they have to destroy Israel. So this is a little bit of a background that I've given you here. So what we see is Israel, which is a democracy in the middle of a region that is beset by turmoil, religious turmoil. It's under attack. Lots of people are being killed. We don't see very many people marching about the few million Syrians who are being killed, and that's very sad. But Israel sits there as a democracy, as the marker for the West, as the last buffer zone for our Judeo-Christian ethic. So what has to happen in order for these extremists to achieve their goal? They need to recreate Israel as the pariah state. If they can recreate Israel as a pariah state, and then the Jews become the enemy. And if the Jews are the enemy, the jihadi ideology becomes a perversion of Islam. And if they can get those three issues in the bag, then they can actually eradicate Israel, they can get rid of the Jews, and we then have Andalusia. So this is taking place in our country today, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware that the CPS has a program called Hate Crime Matters. Hate crime is the new buzzword. It's the next step progression to the totalitarian state. We need to understand that, this crime that they call hate crime. So talking about terrorists is more punishable than the terror itself. Some lives matter above all else. Some beliefs are sanctioned while others are not and vilified. And building a society of polarization in which compassion, what is this, sweetness? Is this a bee? Good luck? Okay, so what is happening is they're building a society of polarization. So we have the them and the us. We have Orwellian. Maybe I've said enough. We have Orwellian organizations that fancy themselves as the prefects and monitors of our morality, who categorize us, projecting the terrorist extremism back on us. So we are called alt-right or ultra-right, and really this has no meaning. It's corporate speak, but it pigeonholes us, and it puts us on lists which makes them correct and makes us wrong. So I am transformed now. I am transformed from the white Jewish woman of apartheid into the alt-right Jewish woman of the new fascist, anti-fascist list keepers. In this process, there is no place for dissension, for disagreement, and debate or negotiation. There is right and there is wrong. Those on the list are wrong, whilst those who make the list are absolutely correct. And this is a society we're beginning to live in. So, in the meantime, we continue to be terrorized, awaiting the next plane or bucket bomb, the next shoe bomb. Maybe we forgot about the shoe bombs, or we don't even know what kind of bomb it is, but we're waiting here. When we came on the train today, Ambrosine and I were sitting there looking for the buckets. Thankfully, we didn't find one. But at the end, when there's the new bombing, we will bring candles, we will bring flowers and tissues to wipe away the tears as we retreat again into submission. Well, today marks the day when we say we will be silenced no longer. We have had enough. Enough of the terror. Enough of the lies. Enough of the hatred. And enough of the stealth takeover of our democracy and our freedom. Those of us here today represent a true cross-section of our society. We are not all from the same background. We're not all from the same belief, but we are and have the same message. All lives matter. All rights matter. Above all freedoms matter and democracy matters. And it's not a coincidence that we left today from the statue of Churchill, without whom we wouldn't be here today. And Churchill, to use his phrase, we cannot allow an iron curtain to settle across our country. So let's stand together in unity and say, we will not be silenced any longer. Thank you.